Hey there, so this video is going to give you 5 signs that you might actually be an ISFJ. And that might come as a surprise to many people because, generally people tend to type as intuitives when they enter the typological domain. And that makes perfect sense. In order to really understand these abstract concepts and in order to be introspective in these ways in the first place, you generally need to have a fair degree of intuition. And this is largely independent of what your type happens to be. And thus it might come across as something of a paradox to many people that the majority of people, or at least a sizable amount of people within this type sphere, are still, for all intents and purposes, an S-type. But again, this can come down to factors that are very much outside of type. Many is the sensor who has not fitted into contemporary social circles, and many is the intuitive who has blended into society perfectly well. I'd be willing to bet the majority of ISFJs here, of which there are many by the way, are going to be, for all intents and purposes, more intuitive than they are sensing. So there ensues a tendency for ISFJs entering the type sphere to mistype as a plethora of intuitive types and generally any other type than what they actually happen to be. So this video is going to give you 5 signs you might actually be an ISFJ and present a deeper cognition-based dive into what's actually going on behind the curtains of this highly underrated cognitive type. And in these kind of videos I do tend to use the entire first sign in order to fully differentiate between cognitive extroversion and cognitive introversion. But since I've already done that distinction so many times in these videos, I'm going to simply gloss over that distinction, refer you back to all the videos where I go into it in more detail, and jump into the more cognitive function-based first sign that you are, in fact, an ISFJ. But for those of you who are unfamiliar with the CPT distinction between cognitive extroversion and cognitive introversion, hopefully this summary will suffice. So people who are cognitively introverted tend to experience an innate pull away from external stimulation and interaction rather than towards it. They tend to exercise introverted functions much more for their own sake, entirely autonomous from an external medium. What's more, the introverted functions tend to provide a kind of safe space for the introverted type. The more you rely upon external interaction to serve as a kind of medium for your introspection, and the more you tend to exercise internal dialogue simply in anticipation of future external interaction to come, the less likely you are an introverted cognitive type. So now let's jump into the first sign that you might very well be an ISFJ, the precision of the introverted sensing, introverted thinking internal world. So when many people think ISFJ, they tend to picture some kind of automaton stuck in a time loop of routines and memories. This is ludicrous and totally underplays what's actually going on behind the scenes for this type. First, let us take the dominant function, introverted sensing. This is an internal lens function that very much sacrifices breadth of perception for fidelity of internal experience. Thus, the internal world of an SI dominant is generally highly concrete and refined. And this is quite different to the much more nebulous and low-resolution internal landscape of the typical NI dominant. Next, let us take the auxiliary function. And this is the function assisting, that is to play an auxiliary role to, the dominant function, introverted thinking. So introverted thinking is an internal codec function, centered much more upon objective codification. Think the refinement of a definition, the creation of an internal model that sufficiently represents the objective order of reality. And if we add these two functions together, we are left with an experientially oriented dominant pairing, with the dominant function being a perceiving function, concerned with the highly intense and precise perception of a more detached internal objective landscape. That is to say, there is a good reason why so many scientists, doctors, astronauts, teachers are ISFJs. They tend to excel at detached rational analysis and logical precision. And in many ways, the ISFJ is very much comparable to the INTP, the same cognitive functions, just with different positions and roles. Whereas the INTP is perception as auxiliary to rationalization, the ISFJ has rationalization as auxiliary to perception. And this makes the ISFJ prioritize the experience of the internal world, using introverted thinking as a means to create a more interesting and novel internal experience. You may have heard that the ISFJ has inferior extroverted intuition, a misconception that we'll get into later in the video. and therefore lack a creative exploratory emphasis. And it is true that insofar as external exploration is concerned, the ISFJ is much more straight and narrow than, say, an NE dominant, focusing much more upon the elimination of possibilities rather than extrapolation. And insofar as internal exploration is concerned, and the degree to which SI draws upon extroverted intuition as a means of inspiration, this is a highly creative and exploratory type. The main difference being, for the ISFJ, it is the details of reality that tend to bring about substantially more joy than they would for, say, an extroverted intuitive dominant. This is a type that tends to find great joy in minute variations that other types may not even notice, never mind appreciate. And a type that also tends to find great joy in the spaces that occur in between all that is real and tangible. Think a microbiologist marveling at not only the variation between various different single-cell organisms, but also at the ecosystem these organisms inhabit. SITI is a pairing that naturally revels in the miracle of life as a whole, interested in not only holistic theories of experiential interconnectedness, but also the very underlying fabric of the atom itself, rather than leaping between nebulous or celestial bodies like an INFJ. The ISFJ tends to begin with the very constituent elements making up any given topic, and this tends to result in a bricklaying process of sequential thought, where each step leads naturally to the next one. But there is a caveat to this ground-up approach. If the ISFJ were to engage in, let's say, existential theories and large-scale societal debates, they would typically have to spend a lot of time really working on the foundations, ensuring every single brick is accounted for as long as it is a new problem, idea, or theory that they have not yet accounted for, and thus cannot default to a pre-existing internal framework in order to solve. The ISFJ would seldom skip a step in their reasoning. And no, defaulting to what has already been proven and established is not an introverted sensing thing. Every single human being under the sun does this in order to conserve brain power. Look up heuristics. If you seldom find your brain jumping from one assumption to another one, save perhaps for things you have already thought about in depth, you may have the more ground-up, precise thinking style of the ISFJ. Furthermore, if you tend to excel within the details and the minutiae, easily spotting minor errors that other people have simply overlooked, or are so sensitive to the nuances of experience that other people seem to largely skip over in their rush to jump to the next thing, you may again be an ISFJ. And on the whole, if you consider your thought process to be more sequential than it is concurrent, going from one step to the other, and indeed easily explaining your process of reasoning after reaching your conclusion, you may want to consider the possibility of having SITI within your cognitive map. So sign number 2 that you may very well be an ISFJ pertains to the nature of being an introverted sensing dominant. And I wanted to put this sign second rather than first because within CPT, the nature of any given perceiving function is very much determined by the rational auxiliary to which it is assigned in this case. So with the first sign out of the way, we can now turn our attention to the more perceptual nature of the ISFJ's dominant pairing. To be an SI dominant in this instance, here given the nature of the ISFJ's TI auxiliary, is to have a high fidelity of internal objective experience. Indeed, you can very much consider this SITI experience to be the Ultra HD of the cognitive functions. So tangible can the internal experience of the ISFJ be that those of an especially imaginative nature can actually have trouble sometimes distinguishing between the objective qualia inside the head and what is actually occurring in external reality. And in this way, introverted sensing can very much blur the lines between what is real. But even these more extreme instances aside, the ISFJ just has such a high resolution of internal experience that the internal world can very much feel more real to this type than the external world. For this reason, the ISFJ that makes the most of their SI dominant capabilities can find the internal world a truly fascinating place to explore. What's more, SI convergence in general tends to give people easier access to a general kind of flow state, where one can entirely lose oneself in a task or ideative process into a relative state of timelessness. And there's a good reason for this, with introverted sensing being a intense and focused lens directed internally. The world itself can essentially shrink to encompass only yourself and that which you are engaged with. And when this state becomes increasingly internalized, the space between the internal world and external world can become increasingly blurry and ill-defined, to the extent where one can feel akin to a ship riding upon the waves of an ocean. You see, the more experience homes in on a single qualia, the less associations made between everything else. The less associations that are being made, the less relative everything becomes. And the less relative everything becomes, the less time exists as a result. Double this up with the more somatic and generally interoceptive attunement to a more concrete, internalized state. And you can see how well suited the SI dominant in general is to a state of flow. But this does tend to be significantly more the case with ISFJs than ISTJs, I might add, as the introverted thinking of the ISFJ in the conversion position tends to make this type a little bit more naturally procedural as they flow from one task to another one in a relative state of automation. If your imagination is seldom cloudy and abstract, forming high-resolution images out of both thought and recall, you may want to consider the possibility that you are an SI dominant. Furthermore, if you can easily enter into an internal flow state, with life feeling less like climbing up a mountain with a bag on your back, and more like sailing upon the waves of an ocean, you may want to consider the possibility of having an introverted SI any axis. Much like their INFJ cousins, the ISFJ has introverted thinking in what me and a couple of other CPT Discord members have labelled the agency function, and shout out to Andrea and Rob for the awesome term. Being a hyperconvergent function, the TI of the ISFJ serves as a focal point of interaction and change. This makes for a highly creative function, but also a highly egoic one. And its very doubling down on TI tends to take energies away from extroverted thinking and into introverted thinking. And as a slight segue, I have to add that the TE blind spot that ensues within this type is much different to that of the INFJ. Whereas the INFJ tends to have an SETE blind spot, the ISFJ tends to have an NETE blind spot. This means the absence of TE in the ISFJ pertains less to the fast uptake of mechanistic information, as it would be in the case of the INFJ, and more to a difficulty with fast-moving and improvisational environments, requiring of more unorthodox exploratory methods. And I'll add on the back of that sub-point, if you will, that if you find such NETE employment difficult, you may want to consider ISFJ as more of a possibility. But back to the TI point, the ISFJ is the type that really takes ownership of their own individual thought process, and as harmonious and oftentimes calm as their outward demeanour might be, the type can actually be remarkably stubborn to entertaining thought processes and even conclusions that conflict with their own. And owing to this heavy TI emphasis, the ISFJ strives to come to their own conclusions and their own personal reconciliation with external reality. And while they tend not to be as metacognitive by nature as the INFJ, they are still a highly theoretical type. It is simply that the TI of the ISFJ concerns itself with the constituent parts of a theory as much as the theory itself. Think the careful refinement of definitions and lines of reasoning, and the absence of the INFJ's nebulous cloud jumping. The TI conclusions of this type, absent a established precedent, generally tend to be very careful and even mathematical in nature. And when you really want to conceive of SITI, you can think of an Ent from Lord of the Rings, because it takes a long time to say anything in old Entish, and they never say anything that isn't worth taking a long time to say. So if you resonate with this more careful employment of an extremely specific introverted thinking and a hyperselectivity of what goes into your introverted thinking, you may want to consider ISFJ as a strong possibility. And just on top of all of that, the introverted thinking of this type, much like their INFJ cousin, tends to be very, very selective with what interests it. It's not uncommon for both ISFJs and INFJs to have very strong hyper-interests, that they may very well, especially for the ISFJs, keep bottled up in the presence of others, because ISFJs generally don't want to let other people know just how interested they are in their niche topics. Because of course the SITI of the ISFJ is highly intense, and as I'm going to mention in the next section, the ISFJ doesn't want to disrupt social harmony with their intensity. So if you relate to this extremely niche down introverted thinking, relative absence of NETE, and the highly sequential and methodical thought process so far described, you might want to strongly consider ISFJ. So now let's move on to sign number 4, that you might very well be an ISFJ. And we've talked a lot about the dominant pairing so far, but this SITI frameworking of this type is counterbalanced by their opposing functions of NeFe, that is, the extroverted intuitive, extroverted feeling opposing functions. Now this is quite different to the SEFE of the INFJ. While both of these types do tend to have that humanitarian curiosity and general compulsion to operate within certain set social parameters, the nature of extroverted feeling is nonetheless quite different between each of these types. Because while the INFJ tends to experience FE in a much more intense and selective manner, the FE of the ISFJ, owing to the extroverted intuitive lens to which it is assigned, tends to be a lot more holistic and amorphous. And this makes for a type naturally attuned to the flow of social harmony and the vibe of the experience. And with these functions being more divergent in this case, the ISFJ tends to be a careful observer of the social flow, naturally foreseeing social consequences and navigating the otherwise volatile waters of the social exchange. You see, with extroverted intuition being a broad external lens, extroverted feeling energies here are effectively spread across a wider surface area. And this makes for an oftentimes natural attunement to not only the emotional state of a single person, but also the emotional vibe of the space that they inhabit. You see, the NEFE of the ISFJ allows this type who, let's be honest, often has very intense and even unique sets of interests to blend and harmonize with any social setting that they see fit. Indeed, a big reason why this type tends to be misunderstood for lacking creative thought and original ideas is because they simply hold themselves back a lot so as not to disturb social harmony. If you resonate with this more abstract perception of the social landscape and perhaps feel misunderstood or not seen for who you truly are, you might want to consider ISFJ. Sign number 5 that you might be an ISFJ, the introverted feeling, sub-authority. So it's easy to confuse the aforementioned FE harmony prioritization with the ISFJ being some kind of pushover or social conformist. You know, a person who keeps all of their opinions in check and even transgresses against their own personal values and desires so as not to, rock the boat. People can look at the externally harmonious and polite demeanor of this type and assume, based on this, a lack of personal identity and values. However, this is actually a type who is naturally deeply attuned to their own personal sense of authenticity, and seldom will they allow the wishes and wants of another person to compromise this. Indeed, people who know an ISFJ closely will attest that they can seldom be pushed to do anything that they do not want to do. Furthermore, while many ISFJs will be willing to compromise their short-term desires for the sake of harmony and pragmatism, many more will be surprisingly set on specific outcomes and unyielding in this pursuit. You see, the paradox here lies in the way that the ISFJ tends to go about achieving these outcomes. The NEFE of the ISFJ can often be so subtle in the way they go about steering these desires that people on the receiving end may not even notice. In this sense, the ISFJ is even the true puppeteer of the 16 types. They can get their own way under the guise of selfless harmonization. But again, going back to the FE authority, the agenda of this type often has a highly humanitarian and altruistic slant. But it is very, very important not to disregard this type's introverted feeling, or falsely assume that this introverted feeling is completely subordinate to the extroverted feeling needs of others. Because in reality, the ISFJ is a highly, highly individualistic type who often crave solitude to be able to pursue whatever they want without needing to accommodate other people. Generally, the less rapport an FE authority type is established with a person, the more introverted feeling may appear to be subordinate to extroverted feeling. People who are close to an ISFJ will mark upon their oftentimes intense interests and even stubborn nature. So if you find your identity and values themselves to mold according to the needs of the situation and the people within it, you may actually be more of a convergent feeling type. If rather, no matter the social situation, your internal desires, identity, values tend to remain consistent, you may want to consider ISFJ. Furthermore, if you have difficulty removing yourself from your internal emotional processes, naturally falling into your introverted feeling world when not distracted by the extroverted feeling stimulation of the external atmosphere, ISFJ may again be worth considering. Bonus point, the extroverted sensing, extroverted thinking dip. For as long as the ISFJ has developed their external function sufficiently, they tend to enjoy a relatively easy access to SETE. Indeed, it is generally this pairing that allows the ISFJ to live up to one of their more accurate stereotypes, the ability to hone into a task with great concentration and complete it without any blemishes. Just as SITI is an intense and precise perception of internal frameworks, so is SETE a precise and intense perception of objective reality. But with the attitude here being primarily convergent, the emphasis is instead upon interaction or active observation, usually passing more through the expression pathway of the cognitive map rather than a default gateway function itself. The SETE of the ISFJ is oftentimes an expression of their carefully crafted and refined internal SITI frameworks. This means that the more the ISFJ perfects their internal frameworks and, dare I say it, routines, the more seamlessly they can express these internal frameworks into external reality. And this makes for a type with a high degree of mastery potential. And given the precision of both of these respective ST pairings and the amazing ability of the ISFJ to oftentimes lose themselves in a task in a Zen-like manner, you can see why this type is so well suited to vocations that require both in-depth knowledge and surgical precision. As previously mentioned, the extroverted thinking of this type is only blind insofar as NETE is concerned. When it comes to SETE, this is a type that possesses remarkable dexterity, focus, and ability to engage with life maximally and authentically. So if this rings true for you, you may very well be an ISFJ. So let's stop all of this intuitive obsessing and start recognizing this type, among others, for the amazing individual it tends to create. And on the note of, the whole common type versus rare type thing, and I might make a video on this in more detail in the future, here's an alternate perspective. Given that everybody is a unique individual, it is actually the most common types that have people who are most pressured to make themselves into a unique individual, to stand out among people who are otherwise cognitively similar to themselves. For example, INFJs are indeed relatively rare, and no actual INFJs don't seem to be more prevalent within this community. The millions of people binging the INFJ content are simply mistyped. And this means the average INFJ won't necessarily meet many people who think the way that they do, and with nobody to intentionally differentiate themselves from, their identity construction may just default to how they think, rather than what makes them truly, authentically themselves. ISFJs, however, do tend to have a more common form of processing information, and with lots of people therefore to differentiate themselves from, the ISFJ may be more likely to really dig into themselves, really find what makes them authentically who they are. And thus it can be types like the ISFJ, the ESTP, the ENFP, who comprise the two rarest personalities. So that concludes the video. I really hope it's been informative, and if you know anyone who you think might benefit from the content of this video, be sure to share it with them as well. If you enjoyed the video, be sure to let me know by leaving a like and maybe leaving a comment as well. I know it's been a little while since I last uploaded a video. I have been doing a bit of traveling, and it's been really, really fulfilling. And it was great just to take a step back and reassess the content I was putting out as well. So thank you for your patience, and I am now back uploading regular videos. If you're uncertain about what type you are, or would simply like to know about how your type applies specifically to you as an individual, I do recommend checking out the CPT type service, that can be typed either by me or my friend Rob. And if you're interested in supporting the channel and the theory on that additional level, CPT is also on Patreon. And it comes with its own little cozy Discord community, which is going really well at the moment, and it's absolutely fantastic to see everybody connecting over there, talking CPT. And I also do a live stream over there every month as well. So that's it for me, and I'll be back in a couple of weeks. For now, take care.